Welcome, Austin. I'm so glad that you're joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, for anybody who's been living under a rock and doesn't know who you are, can you share a little bit about yourself and then your journey as an artist and an author?
Yeah, my name's Austin Kleon, and I live in Austin, Texas, and I'm a writer and an artist. I'm best known for this book called Steal Like an Artist, that actually started a trilogy of books. The other two are called Show Your Work and Keep Going. Those have, they're kind of like guides to creativity in the digital age, and they've become, fairly popular. And so I write books, and I run a weekly newsletter and make art. And some people might have seen my blackout poems, which is where I take the New York Times and I cross out words, leaving a poem behind.
It's one of my favorite things that you do, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So, but as you said, the Steal Like an Artist book is really what many people know you for. I actually think that changed a generation of teachers and creative people, and just in how they think about art, think about work in general and art and the two together and how they make significance. So, but my question for you is, how has that book changed you and in turn your process, if at all?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I mean, that book changed my life because it sort of like, when you're a young writer and artist starting out, your biggest battle is obscurity. You're just trying to get people to know you and to know your work. And once you become known, you get a whole new set of problems. And it's really interesting. So, like, once you have a book out in the world that people have read and they love and they want another one, then it becomes, oh no, how do I do this while people are watching? Because Steal Like an Artist was a book that was made from someone who had an audience, but not a huge audience. And so after Steal Like an Artist became a bestseller and, like, became the book that it is, then I had to kind of say, okay, well, what do I do with this now? Like, where do you go from here? Yeah. And I've always been really interested in just that tension between being known and hiding and trying to, because the artist really needs to be able to hide, in order to bring forth what's worthwhile, but they need an audience to survive.
Right, it's that weird juxtaposition. Yeah, it's like the musician who gets a hit art album, and then suddenly their sophomore album comes out, and people either love it or they really hate it because it's nothing like the first one, right? So
very much so.
How do you fight that? Like, how do you like have to mentally deal with that, I guess?
Well, there's a couple of ways you can do it. I love thinking about music, and I think bands are a really interesting way to think about it. Take a band like Radiohead, who I sort of grew up with. OK Computer came out when I was like, I don't know, freshman, high school, middle school, something like that. They had sort of gone as far as they could go with that sound. And they had huge critical acclaim. The album sold pretty well. This is back when people bought CDs and you could make a living. So they did this kind of 180 and flipped around and did Kid A, which is this very like almost alienating, kind of brooding electronic album that was really shocking at the time. But the way they did it is to kind of like, that wasn't their sophomore effort. That was their fourth album. But that idea of like what you do after a big success is like really, really interesting to me. And music is a great example. You have a band like same era, like someone like Nirvana, a few years earlier, they have a, massive best-selling hit like Nevermind. And then they do like this very abrasive, kind of rougher album that's truer to their sound in Utero, which is their follow-up. So, it is an interesting question. I don't know. I think a lot of times you'll find that the artist sort of rails a little bit against their fame or against their success, and they're trying to search for like that thing that originally brought them to the work. And so it's an interesting tension that you have to work out. For me, it was just a matter, for me specifically, what was interesting was when I did Steal Like an Artist, I didn't know I had written a self-help book. I thought it was just a book about like how to be an artist. And then I kind of discovered that there's this whole, creativity section in the bookstore, which I didn't know about. And then it became, okay, so your book is in this genre and it's on this shelf, then what can you do? How can you play with this? Like, how can you make this, like, you find yourself in this position, so, like, how can you play with this? And that's how I approach the other books.
I like this idea that you're playing with it, rather because some people will, like you said, rail against it and either try something completely different and push it out because the pressure is too much, or they try to make it exactly like what they did the first time and they can't capture the same magic. So I like this idea of playing with that. Do you feel like, you said you did that with the other two books, do you feel like the latest one, Keep Going, how is that different than Steal Like an Artist? What's unique about Keep Going from the first one?
Well, I think Keep Going is different because I'm different. I mean, it was written 7 years later, and I'd been through, when I wrote Steal Like an Artist, I didn't have kids yet. I really hadn't... The climate was different. I mean, like, there was a different presidential administration. I won't go too deep into it, but, like, the country had a different tone. It wasn't, like, the Steal Like an Artist came out in 2012, and it was, like, a very cheerful, kind of upbeat time, or at least around the people I know. And then 2019 was, like, a very dark kind of time. And I think the other thing that happened in that time frame between 2012 and 2019 is social media really went, sideways. Yeah. And I think people really, that's really a book about, like, how do you keep your head when the world is really nuts? Like, how do you be creative when the world is crazy? And the answer is, well, the world's always crazy, so you have to, like, figure out your deal. But I always thought of the trilogy as, I always loved the Indiana Jones trilogy when I was a kid. So
me too.
Keep Going is sort of the last crusade of the trilogy. So it's kind of, it calls back to Steal Like an Artist, but it's in the same format, but it's got a kind of depth to it that I think is a little bit more evolved than Steal Like an Artist.
And I really am interested in this idea of the trilogy. Did you think of it that way as you were writing them? Like, you knew, like, I wanted to create this like a trilogy, or is it just kind of how it evolved?
No, when I did Show Your Work, the idea was that it was going to be a Robin Hood box set. So first you steal, then you share. Yeah. So that, like, I thought of them as a duology, when I did Show Your Work. And then as time went on, the question became, is there a third book? Is it a trilogy? And what would that be? Yeah. And I took 5 years in between Show Your Work and Keep Going. And so now that trilogy's wrapped up, of course, the question becomes, is this a trilogy or is this I'm losing the words, but, are there 4 books? Are there 5 books? Is there a whole shelf of these little, like, and that's something that I just have to figure out, creatively myself.
Yeah, sure. So that when you talked a little bit about the book, that it's a little bit more nuanced than, a little bit deeper than the first book. But I find the way that you write your books a little cheeky. Like, I put this in our notes that it's they kind of portray this, I'm a little self-help book, or I'm going to be a gift that you can give your, senior graduating from high school. But inside there are these nuggets of wisdom that resonate well beyond what those books would typically do. So why did you choose this format? I'm curious. And, like, what made you go in that direction?
Well, that's a very astute, that's how I like to think of them, as they're kind of disarming. You pick it up and it's cute. And you're like, oh, what is this? And then you flip through it and you're like, oh, wait a minute. This has a little bit of depth and a little tooth to it even. What happened was that I just didn't know what I was doing with Steal Like an Artist. I had done a book before that was a poetry book. Mm-hmm. Steal Like an Artist was just a talk that I had done that had pictures and words in it. And that was the format of the book was really the idea of my editor, Bruce Tracy at Workman. He said, well, slides are usually, people ask me all the time, well, how'd you come up with the square book? And I said, well, my editor said that, well, slides are usually landscape and books are usually portrait. Why don't we do a square book? And they said, well, that sounds fun. Yeah, let's do that. And that's like pretty much that was the thought behind it. But then what happened was, the book designer, Lydia Tomas, she took a go at it, and we went through it a couple times. And what happened is I discovered, really by luck, that the illustrated gift book just happens to be a commercial medium. By that, you can actually sell some books with it.
Yeah.
That, for someone like me, it is really the perfect thing, because I'm somebody who really, my books sing when I'm able to use all of the things I like to do, like when there's, there's the writing, of course, but then there's the layout and the structure, but also the illustrations and all the artwork that goes into it. It just turned out to be the perfect format for someone who I consider is pretty weird. I mean, I'm someone who I think what I do is kind of weird. So to have a format that's pretty commercial and kind of mainstream, it's like the kind of thing you'd see like in a, I don't know, like they sell them in the FedEx Kinkos. I mean, right. or the craft store at the cash register or something. For me, it's really like a dream come true to find a commercial format that you can kind of let all your weirdness as a creative person into.
Yeah.
That is the whole thing that really made the books wonderful to me. Now, when we did the first 3 books, Workman, my publisher, was an independent company, and I had a editor, Bruce Tracy, who was great. We worked on all the books together. Bruce has since retired, and Workman has become a conglomerate. I mean, they've been bought by Hachette, so the publishing industry changes. And so the question will be for the next, couple of books, am I able to find a publisher that we can do these kind of handmade? I think of them as fancy zines, basically.
Yeah.
I'm a huge zine nut. Yeah. And so I think of them as fancy zines. They're very handmade. And people ask, like, well, what's the, what font do you use for the headlines? And I'm like, it's not a font. It's literally me handwriting, lettering everything. And they're like, well, why don't you just make a font out of your handwriting? And I'm like, because I think you can really tell. I think you can really tell that there are things in this book that are handmade. And I like that tension between the handmade elements and the typeset, very kind of prim and proper serif typeface. I'm just a nerd that way. I like everything about books is what I think. I really think about the whole feel and every little element of the book is I'm obsessed with.
The craft. I mean, you can tell you're very much into the craft of it. And I'm going to tie this back, and this is a little off script, I think, but I'm looking at the record player behind you, and I'm noticing all the vinyls, and for me, as an 80s baby, one of the gifts that my husband gave me that I absolutely adore is the vinyl record player, going back to the 33s and being able to go back through my parents', album collections that I never appreciated when I was younger and so appreciate now. Turn on Chris Stapleton on to 33 and I'm like in heaven. So but that, I think, again, it's reminding me how much you're into the craft, because there's a difference between a vinyl, a CD, and digital, right? And you can hear it when you're listening as an audience member, the same way that you can tell when something is artificial or if it's very much real, right? That you've put the thought behind it. So I'm wondering, just because I'm an arts integration specialist, this is what I do. I look at merging things together. Does your love of music and clearly the art of music itself, do you feel like that influences your artistic practice, and your artistic practice may in turn also influence your love of music?
100%. I won't get up to get it, but the back of Steal Like an Artist, I wanted to look like a track list on the back of a CD.
Yeah.
And I actually think about, when I make these books, I think about them as albums, in the sense that you have songs, the chapters are songs, mm-hmm. and the track list, is the structure. Mm-hmm. And so I am a musician myself, mm-hmm. Just like everyone else in Austin. Music's like my hobby or side project, passion. So I would say that music deeply influences the books, not just in the content, because there are stories of musicians and stuff like that, but I actually I always wanted Steal Like an Artist to feel like a punk album. I really wanted it to feel like a Ramones record, or something very fast and comes at you quick. Yeah. But that you could replay over and over. I really wanted it to be that way, and I always loved that the books kind of looked like a CD. Yeah. And it was funny, because when we did we did some calendars. And calendars are like 12 by 12, so they're almost like a vinyl size. So I kind of used to hold the calendar and be like, "Oh, this is like what it would be like if it was on record." So there is a kind of wish fulfillment to that, And I would also say that liner notes are very much what I want my books to feel like, in a sense. Mm-hmm. Lots of images and text and all that. So I would say music is a huge, it's not just, I listen to music when I'm in the studio and, blah, blah, blah. It's really the whole, I think in some ways making books is my version of trying to make records.
I can see that. And having gone through your books, and, they're very well worn in our household, I can see that resonate through that book. So I think, for me, it just feels like, I keep coming back to this word real, Austin. Your work just feels real in a world where that is no longer common ever. So
thank you. It's a huge compliment to me. I think one reason the books feel real is because there's a real person behind them. A lot of books are, and this is not a bad thing, but a lot of books are the product of teams, really. There's an editor, there's always an editor, but then there's a design team, and then there's my hand is all over these books. And so I think that's part of what comes through in the books, is just that one person made everything. And I think the fact that it's multimodal as far as verbal and visual, then you really get to feel more of me, because you get me not just as a writer, you get me as a visual thinker and an artist, and you get these different textures. So let me say, by the way, I'm not thinking about any of this when I put a book together. This is the critical, hindsight brain looking at this. When you're doing the work, you're not thinking. It's like Top Gun and Maverick. You don't have time to think.
Right, just do.
You
Don't
think
think,
you're
just
dead.
do. Yes, yes.
So, so I would say, like, it's everyone, watching and listening. This sounds really good in hindsight. It's not what I think about when I'm making it, and I think that is part of the naturalness to it. Is I'm just doing what seems intuitive to me, and so that's what works. And again, it's the weird chance and randomness of the process, just like.
Mm-hmm.
How did you end up with the square book? Well, a landscape and portrait, and we just made it square.
Settled in the center. Yeah, of course. So I would love to play a little word association game if you're up for it.
Okay.
Based on, these are words that I've selected from that are pretty heavily used in your books and on your blog, and in some of the research that I've done in other articles that you have participated in. So I'm just going to say a word, and I would love for you to just immediately say what you associate with that word.
Okay.
All right, so here we go. Perfect.
Wrong.
Irreverence.
Comedy.
Play.
Kids.
Pursuit.
Trivial.
Of course. All right, last one. Last one. Artist.
Work.
I love that. And here's the thing. It's like Music in Our Schools Month, and it's Art in Our Schools Month, and, and I find it ironic that it's at the same time as Testing in Our Schools Month. And so when people think of artists, they don't think of work, right? They think it's some sort of like magical thing that just happens, and it's not. It's clearly work. I love that you associated with that.
Well, one of my favorite stories is Mr. Rogers would bring sculptors and musicians and people who did different things. He would bring them on the show. And, sometimes the people would say to him, well, I don't know how to talk to kids. Like, what do I say about my work or whatever? And he'd say, I don't want you to talk. He's like, I don't want you to talk to the kids. I want you to do what you love in front of them. And to me, that is really, with my own kids, we live in a world in which it's very hard for people to see you working, because so much of what we do is this kind of digital, ephemeral, intangible work that happens on a screen and whatever. And so one of the gifts of being someone who makes a lot of things by hand is that your kids can see you working. And so, like, with my kids, I mean, Dad's always got his head in a book, or he's always, like, scribbling in some notebook, or, my kids don't care at all about what I do, which is wonderful. Because, but I do think in terms of, I think part of the reason that the books mean something to me, and I think the reason they feel real, if they do, is that they are the books I wish I had when I was a kid, because I grew up in a very rural area, and I didn't know anyone who did the kind of things that I wanted to do. And so the books are, I used to wonder, like, just how do you do this? And so in a sense, the books are me trying to do that for my former self. And so, but I think it's a real, I think, I believe deeply in the power of simply doing what you love in front of people. And I think that activates something. I think it's true. I also tend to think that everything good for kids is good for adults.
Yes.
And so there is, part of the problem with kids is getting them exposed to all the different ways of being in the world, because you don't know what's going to activate. A kid doesn't know what's right until they see it being done in front of them, right? You might be a great welder, but you never see anybody weld anything. Or you might actually be really good at milking cows or being a farmer or whatever, but you've never been on a farm before. So it's this kind of like, there's so much exposure. It's really an exposure problem. We have this world right now where, supposedly we're all connected and we can see each other, but, it's like, what do kids want to be right now? Well, they want to be YouTubers.
Yeah.
Or what? So we need to find a way to, for me, it's like, I think parents, I think parents are always pushing their children to, take violin lessons or take karate or whatever, but I'm always telling people, well, do you listen to symphony? Do you listen to classical music in the house? Do you play an instrument? Do they see you practice anything? Do you do Tai Chi out in the yard? It's like, I think that the more you can do and really do things in front of kids, the better off they, even if they don't respond to it now, those images will always stay in their minds, and those memories will always exist. So I'll step off the soapbox.
No. It reminds me a lot of Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, and knowing like the opportunities that's the difference. That's the difference between a Steve Jobs and somebody who is only like working on a computer and not developing a brand. It's his opportunities were different. And so I think that's what you speak to, is the idea of what opportunities are we making available and what are we showing and working on together. And that's definitely something that's missing. That togetherness is missing. To close out though, Austin, there's a question I always ask everybody, and that's what if you could tell teachers one thing about creativity, what would you want them to know?
I think I would say that I would quote Jim Henson to them that attitude is I think it's attitude. Attitude is caught, not taught.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true of creativity. I think it's caught, not taught. And when I talk to teachers, the number one thing teachers don't have is time. I mean, they do not take time for themselves. They are constantly working. They're constantly grading papers. They're constantly coming up with lesson plans and emails and meetings. To take the time in your life to do something creative, something that lights you up, something that gives you energy, you have to do it, because kids can tell when somebody is turned on. And the way to turn yourself on is to spend the time doing the things that light you up. And I think that, that to me is the thing, that creativity is caught, not taught. And you have to practice the very thing that you are trying to impart to the kids. And that could be creativity that can be, a hobby you have at home. That could be the way you put your lesson plans together. That can be in your materials. But you have to be, unfortunately, with kids, it's like we have to be the adults we want them to become. And it's like, oh, geez.
No pressure.
Yeah. I mean, the fun thing for me is that, I really just get to be the kid I was. A big part of my job is just being who I was when I was 13 and sitting in my room making stuff. So that's a good gig to have.
I was going to say, that's living the dream, quite honestly.
It is. It is very much so.
Awesome. So where can people find you online? Where can they stay in contact with you?
The easiest thing is to just Google me, Austin Kleon, or go to austinkleon.com. My website, I'm old school. I still have a blog that's up to date all the time. And the thing that people really like that I do online is my weekly newsletter. It's free on Friday. It's a list of 10 things that I think are worth sharing every week. It's it's like my books. It's fast. It's there's always a lot of stuff in it, and you can get through it pretty quick. And if you like that, now we have a community that's kind of forming in the comments there. That's really fun. And that's something free to check out, to figure out if you like me. If you like my newsletter, you'll like the books, and vice versa.
Well, I highly recommend, because I get entertained every Friday. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Of course, thank you. And I am excited for all of our teachers to pick up all 3 of your books now that we got a trilogy going on. Thank you for what you do in the world, Austin. It really does make a difference.
Well, you've made my day for saying so.